Hello YouTube, Red Pill Tyler here. In my last video we've seen how feminism, toxic masculinity, and gynocentrism together acts as a driving force to ruin men and families. Gynocentrism is a bad set of beliefs and ideas that gains traction in each and every part of this world. We, as human beings, generally value the well-being of women, and we've brought up an assumption that women are to be protected and provided for, at the expense of men throughout the entire course of our history. Of course this was necessary for the survival of our species, as a whole, around 100,000 to millions of years ago. But this assumption isn't necessary for us any longer in this day and age. Gynocentrism is what led to the formation of the patriarchy, which feminists like to shit on all the time. The patriarchy is what led to civilization. In other words, the patriarchy laid the foundation of a well-organized society. But feminists don't understand this, and they don't realize the fact that gynocentrism is actually an innate biological instinct of the human ape, which was widely accepted by both men and women alike. Feminism is nothing but an extreme form of gynocentrism, which believes on the idea that women are perceived as good, whereas men on the other hand are perceived as bad. This idea has to be stopped as much as we can. In today's video, I'll be explaining in detail about gynocentrism, and how it leads to the dehumanization of men, either by male disposability, or by male exploitation. Without further ado, let's get started. Gynocentrism and the Dehumanization of Men. Part 1. Since this is a very long topic to be covered, I shall be explaining it by dividing this topic into two parts. Part 1, and Part 2. Part 2 will be discussed in my next video. So let us begin with the definitions of these two given terms. What do we exactly mean when we call something as disposable? Something is disposable when it has little or no value, and can be easily replaced and readily discarded. Disposable cutlery is one example of this. Highly valuable items that cannot be easily replaced or readily discarded are not something we consider to be as disposable. Famous paintings come to my mind as one example of what we would not consider to be disposable. So what do we mean by, when we use the term, male disposability? The Wikipedia defines male disposability as the idea that society can better cope with the loss of a typical man than with the loss of a typical woman. While that might be true, the real question is, how does gynocentrism lead to male disposability? Well, I'll throw in some real-world facts for you. Human beings are a sexually dimorphic species. Sexual dimorphism is the condition where the two sexes of the same species exhibit different characteristics, beyond the differences in their sexual organs. As a result, we innately, and generally unconsciously, value the well-being of females over males. This has created a gender compassion gap, where both men and women are hypersensitive to the suffering of women, and callous to the suffering of men. This is what led to gynocentrism, and our society has already nurtured this gynocentric culture. Even though 76% of the suicides are men, 85% of the homeless are men, 70% of the homicide victims are men, 40% of the domestic abuse victims are men, 90% of the workplace deaths are men, the majority victims of violent crimes are men, on average serve 64% longer in prison than women, more likely to be victims of sexual assault when you include prison rape. On average are 3.4 times more likely to be imprisoned than women even when both have committed the same crime, and I could go on. Even though all of that is true, the vast majority of society still perceives women as needing more support than men. This is the reason why we're concerned about violence against women, but not men. This is the reason why there are thousands of shelters for female victims of domestic violence, and only a few shelters for men despite the overwhelming evidence showing gender parity in domestic violence cases. This overwhelming data brings us to the conclusion that gynocentrism is what led to the disposability of the male gender. But nevertheless, I've always had a problem with the concept of male disposability as a generalized description of the state of men's lives throughout history. People that are truly disposable are exterminated in death camps and dehumanized to the point their very right to exist is challenged. Genocide is what the end result of disposability of a group looks like at a societal level. When society considers a group of people to be disposable, they are disposed of. There is a difference between facing discrimination or being marginalized and actually being considered to be disposable. Disposability implies that society considers men to be of little or no value and something to be eradicated. Throughout history it is certainly the case that we've always had some degree of misandry in the culture. I would certainly agree that to some degree male disposability has existed throughout history. However, I would not agree it was systemic. The only exception to this would be during war. Opposing armies have certainly regarded each other as a threat to be eliminated, and the dehumanization of men in war has resulted in enormous loss of life and gruesome abuses as a result. We only have to look at prisoner of war camps and the millions of dead bodies on battlefields to attest to male disposability in war. Male disposability in war dwarfs any other historical example of male disposability by orders of magnitude. However, even in war, men of opposing armies have demonstrated extraordinary civility with their opposing male counterparts at times. The Christmas truce of World War I being one example of this. Men in an unofficial ceasefire instigated by the soldiers themselves decided to lay down their arms, fraternize with the enemy, and celebrate Christmas with each other. It is even suspected there may have been a football match. To repeat, I am certainly not suggesting male disposability has not occurred in our history, or on a large scale in times of war. However, I think there has been a mistake in understanding the true nature of the discrimination men have historically faced, versus what they now face today. Like soldiers that do not value the life of their enemy, society does not value the life of people it considers to be disposable. Disposable people are disposed of, and it eventually leads to war, or alternatively civil unrest, revolution, and then genocide. I think what we call as historical male disposability is actually better described as the exploitation of men. Men have historically faced exploitation to a much greater degree than disposability. For as long as civilization has existed, society has gone to great efforts to control men and exploit male labor. If men truly had no value whatsoever, and they truly were regarded as disposable, then our society would be indifferent towards men and would put no effort into controlling and exploiting them, because doing so would yield nothing of value. In reality, I think men are not disposable and men actually have tremendous value. In fact, I think men have so much value that the society and the aristocracy have been so dependent on that value to survive and build civilization and expand their empires in such a way that enormous efforts have been put into controlling men and exploiting them. This exploitation has often come at the expense of men themselves and has been used to build and expand empires and nation-states for the ruling class. Men have certainly faced exploitation to varying degrees throughout history, but that does not mean that was the entirety of their experience. There has certainly been some level of disregard for the well-being of men throughout history, because of the desire of the ruling elite to exploit men for their own benefit. However, it has not been a complete disregard for men, like what we would see if men were truly regarded as disposable. There was some logical understanding in past society of the need to look after men, so that the value that men can provide can be harnessed and exploited. Men pressed onto ships were given vitamin C. Men conscripted into armies were fed, clothed, and given shelter. And men working in mines were given at least some incentive to work under incredibly dangerous conditions. Even slaves on plantations or that built ancient structures had to be adequately looked after by their masters to perform the labor they would be involuntarily forced to do. Does this make exploitation acceptable? Of course not. However, there is a very dark contrast between a group that is exploited and a group that is considered disposable. It is an important distinction to make when we consider how men may have been treated historically and how men are treated today. In the past it was known that men had to be supported to some degree, and society had to help raise boys so they could perform their role. There used to be a cognitive connection in society of the need to look after men, so they could in turn look after society. Societies that flourished ensured their men were in a good enough condition to perform for society. Societies that treated men as disposable and neglected the health of their men, neglected the foundations of their own civilization. The armies that took care of their soldiers had the stronger and fitter men to win the war. The armies that lost the least amount of men survived to fight and win another battle. This is the simple logic of survival, and in our dangerous and volatile past such pragmatic thinking was essential for the continuation of societies. This is the logic that our culture has lost because of the technological and debt-driven bubble of peace and prosperity we have created over the last 3 centuries since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. It is a bubble that insulates society from the harsh reality of survival and has led to all sorts of delusional ideologies and belief systems flourishing. This bubble has not eliminated the basic requirements to sustain civilization, but it has merely delayed the time period between the decisions and actions we make today as a society, and the future consequences for those actions and decisions. The bubble creates a temporal buffer that allows society to lose perceptual awareness of the connection between action and consequence and reality itself. The consequences will arrive, but when they do, it will be the accumulation of consequences from decades of reckless and delusional decision-making. That's the danger. It is a danger that COVID-19 has given us just a little inkling of what to expect, if we keep ignoring basic realities about the nature of the world we live in and the nature of ourselves as a species, as a society and as individuals. To repeat, I am not suggesting men have had it good for centuries. The exploitation of men was a significant trend in historical society, particularly in the lower classes. Society has placed enormous amounts of effort into controlling men and regulating how men perceive themselves and other men. Men are sold a lie from birth that they can only be considered as a man, and have a place in society, if they perform as human doings. I hope you can understand the difference between a human being and a human doing.
A man provides. And he does it even when he's not appreciated, or respected, or even loved. He simply bears up, and he does it because he's a man.
This is what drives precarious manhood. This cultural message is the carrot and the stick that society uses to keep men in line and to keep the machinery of male exploitation going. Be a gentleman, do your duty, be a man, and if you don't do your duty, here's a white feather for you. All of this is psychological blackmail to shame men into their own exploitation, keeping men ignorant of their own intrinsic value as human beings, and beating into them from birth that their masculine value is externally derived is the key mechanism that society depends on to control men. This form of control works so well because human beings are herd animals, and we like to conform to the group to belong and form affiliations. Men that don't toe the line are ostracized from their community. Remember that men are raised in an environment with this social programming and social pressure to conform to what a man is, from the earliest years of their life. Despite all of these social pressures, men have still fought against their own exploitation. The development of our legal system and the concept of people having rights have all followed from men rising up against authoritarianism in one form or another, and to their own exploitation. Men have fought revolutions and wars over their own exploitation. The past is a mixture of society giving men the bare minimum concern for their well-being, and men pushing back and demanding better treatment from society. In some cases society has treated men fairly, and in some cases society has treated men poorly. Often it has been men in the lower classes of society that have been treated the worst, and the remainder of men have faced a mixture of fair and exploitative treatment. The lower classes of men have been the invisible workers and the invisible homeless of our societies. They are the men the ruling aristocracy have been able to most effectively exploit, because they are the most powerless in our society to do anything about it. They were the ones who were sent to the mines and to the trenches during war in millions. It would be wrong to describe the system exploiting poor men as the feminist narrative of the patriarchy. That's bullshit. This is not a system that privileges men because they are men. Men were only given a partial reprieve from exploitation if they were wealthy, and even then, they were exposed to unfair treatment relative to women of the same class because they were men. A clear example of this can be seen with the Titanic. Even women in third class had a better chance of survival than men in first class. In the case of the Titanic, we do have a historical incidence of male disposability. When the logic of survival no longer demands that looking after men is conducive to enhancing the survival of a group, and men are living in a culture of male exploitation that regards them as human doings and not as human beings, then men predictably will face disposability when society sees no use for them and has a reduced concept of them as human beings. Historical incidences of male disposability did occur, but outside of war these incidents were exceptional and often noted in our history for the exceptions that they were. Examples like the Titanic do illustrate that the discrimination men faced cannot be entirely attributed to class and was at least partly the result of simply being male. And all of these fucked up nonsense feminist concepts of the so-called male privilege and the patriarchy simply fucking fly away in the face of history. Men were not privileged to die on the Titanic or die in the numerous wars fought over history. Aristocratic women have played a key role over the centuries in developing and codifying into the culture a system of male exploitation to serve women at the expense of men. In other words, they were the ones who were responsible for creating a gynocentric culture. As we know, power corrupts, and the female aristocracy, like their male counterparts, enjoyed considerable power over society. Gynocentrism spread so effectively throughout society, partly because it came from people of influence, and also because there was already some form of male exploitation in society, particularly among the vast numbers of poor peasants. It is predictable that even today, the worst forms of gynocentrism are promoted by the upper echelons of society and felt the worst by the lower rungs of society. Of course, gynocentrism exists at all levels of society, but the general pattern that is observed is what I have just described. Men who have fought against all forms of exploitation throughout history, but have been relatively silent when it comes to gynocentrism. The reason for this is because men are raised from birth with another big lie that men have all the power in relation to women, and women are powerless in relation to men. This is the myth Dr. Warren Farrell debunked in his masterpiece, The Myth of Male Power. Men are agents, women are damsels in distress. That is the narrative feminism rests on, and that narrative is ultimately dependent on the myth of male power deeply embedded in our culture. Feminist ideology depends on maintaining a narrative of female victimhood and male agency. Any mainstream acknowledgement of female power over men and any scrutiny of it is not permitted in our gynocentric culture. Men don't want to hear about it and women don't want to hear about it. Society is uncomfortable confronting the power women have over men and the consequences of that power. Why? Because society has a problem holding women responsible for what they do to men. But why? Holding women responsible for what they do to men would require society to consider men as human beings first, and that would undermine the whole societal system of male exploitation. As I mentioned earlier, men are told a life from birth that their whole worth is externally derived from how well they perform as a human doing. Men are especially judged and evaluated as well by women on how well they perform as human doings. Women will not date losers, or men they perceive to be weak. Women don't generally prefer dating men that earn less than they do, despite all of this mantra about female empowerment. This lie that men are human doings and the social pressure associated with it demands that men must see themselves as powerful and as agents to protect their own sense of self-worth. Human doings can't be permitted to be in the vulnerable and powerless position, otherwise their capacity to do is questioned. So when you consider these two lies men are told from birth, and are socially programmed to follow, we can predict men will be blind to their own exploitation when it comes in the form of gynocentrism. Men will recognize fascism and fight against it, but not feminist fascism in a dress. Men are told from birth by our culture that they have all the power, and are told a narrative men have always held the power and are responsible for everything bad that has ever happened. Men are taught to associate power with positions of authority, and men see that men do indeed hold all of the positions of authority. So predictably from all of this social programming, men in society form a perception that men have all the power, and women are the weaker sex that need to be protected and cared for. Men cannot see themselves in a position of less power in relation to women, because they have not been raised to identify such situations and because their sense of self-worth and finding a partner depends on constantly maintaining a mindset that they are agents with power. Adding to these two dynamics, we then have chivalry playing on men's desire to perform to earn externally derived worth from women and society. Despite what people may think, chivalry is alive and well in the present day and has just taken a different form to what we observed in the past. Today we identify modern-day chivalry in the manosphere, or the MGTOW community, as simping. Men do not recognize gynocentrism as a form of exploitation because men's sense of self views the exploitive dynamic of gynocentrism as a source of pride rather than a source of shame. Men willingly go along with their own gynocentric exploitation because that's what they think a man does. To summarize, it is the concept of chivalry that constructs men's self-worth and men's perception of power that prevents men from seeing their own gynocentric exploitation. If business partnerships resembled modern marriage, no man would form a business partnership. To paraphrase Dr. Warren Farrell from The Myth of Male Power, men are taught that earning money someone else spends while they die sooner is power. Men are blind to how they are being exploited, because of the three factors I have identified. Yes, biology is certainly at play and I will have more to say on that in my further videos. However, biology alone does not result in gynocentrism. Gynocentrism is just one pathological manifestation of biology, like murder, racism and every other human vice. Culture is not purely an extension of biology, but a product of a continuous feedback loop between the environment and biology. Culture can become corrupted with certain pathological elements, and those pathological aspects of our culture can hijack our psychological drives in maladaptive ways. Certain pathological elements can arise in our culture when certain environmental conditions persist for long periods. These pathological aspects of culture can short-circuit our base biological drives, and gynocentrism is one of them. When men's perception of power, self-worth, and responsibilities in relation to the opposite sex are distorted in the way that they are, men cannot psychologically protect themselves from the cultural pathology of gynocentrism. It is analogous to the immune system failing to recognize a parasitic infection. Remember that men are conditioned from birth to form a distorted cognitive and perceptual framework around power, self-worth, and responsibility when it comes to their interactions with the opposite sex. This social programming has been going on for centuries now, from generation to generation. When you consider the social pressure on men to maintain this blue pill perception, from our institutions, from our culture, from their peers, and that men are exposed to this gynocentric programming right from birth, it is like coming out of the Matrix and just as hard to do. Like what Morpheus said to Neo about people in the Matrix, many men will fight to protect the system that exploits them. Without an identifiable and attractive alternative to forming their own sense of self-worth, many will resist any challenge to their gynocentric programming, and even then, it is an uphill battle. When men are dependent on gynocentric social programming to maintain their sense of self-worth, they will fight against any challenge to gynocentrism out of psychological self-defense. That's the hurdle men have to overcome to adopt a red pill perception of the world. That's why, unlike other forms of exploitation, many men fail to challenge gynocentrism and actually fight for it. Men's sense of self-worth is tied up in gynocentrism because of those three factors I spoke of earlier and all of the biological buttons they press. When these factors are combined with a narrative and an image cultivated in our gynocentric culture that masks female vice and magnifies female virtue at every turn and conversely does the complete opposite in relation to men, we have the perfect recipe for the blind acceptance of the gynocentric exploitation of men. It's the deification of women and the demonization of men. Women are wonderful, women are powerless but divine, men are human doings, and men must act like men, and be chivalrous and rise above their animal state. That is the gynocentric message in our culture. True female power, not the feminist fucked up nonsense, is not only largely unacknowledged in our culture that views women as perpetual victims. Even when female power is recognized in society, the image of female innocence cloaks any female abuse directed at men from receiving any significant degree of societal attention and condemnation. That is the cultural milieu that male exploitation grows in and why it is so hard to combat.